The economic historian Deirdre McCloskey gave a stimulating and provocative talk on the causes of the Industrial Revolution at the Conference of Economists in Melbourne earlier this year. I didn't agree with much of what she said, but I did agree with her first 4 words. PowerPoint is evil. Somebody said that should have been 3 words, which reinforces the point, I think. So bear with me if I have no slides. The background to this presentation is as follows. Back in 2010, Therese Jefferson and I submitted a paper with the same title as the one that I'm giving today to the JPKE. Paul Davidson accepted it without requiring any revisions except to the title, which he disliked and insisted on replacing with something blander. The paper came out as the lead article in the winter 2010-11 issue of the journal, which was gratifying. Unknown to us, Paul made it part of a mini symposium. The other contributions being a full-length article by Matthew Fung from St. Peter's College in New York, who had already published on similar themes in the journal, and a short piece by Davidson himself. Fung essentially supported the position that Therese and I had taken, pointing to the considerable amount of common ground shared by Post Keynesians and old behavioural economists, and suggesting that more recent developments in new behavioural economics could be put to productive use as resources in post-Keynesian macroeconomics. Davidson's brief contribution had the title, "Was Keynes the first behavioural economist?" which he answered in the affirmative, focusing on the role of uncertainty, conventions and herd behaviour in the general theory, and suggesting that Keynes had anticipated much of the modern work in neuronomics. I'm very grateful to the organisers of this conference for an opportunity to revisit the issues that were raised in this mini-symposium. I'm taking it as read that there's considerable scope for cooperation between old behavioural economists and post-Keynesians on questions of microeconomics, and instead I want to explore the more difficult and more interesting question of the relationship between behavioural economists and post-Keynesian macro. I'll begin by providing a slightly different answer to Paul Davidson's question regarding Keynes. Then I'll come back to the question of behavioural macroeconomics, which in 2010 Therese and I had described as very largely a failure. New book with this title, edited by my friend and Melbourne neighbour Ian MacDonald, sheds a little more light on this subject and calls for some revision of that conclusion. Then I want to say something about what old behavioural economists have had to say about macroeconomics, beginning with Herbert Simon, the founder of the school, and looking at some of his followers. Then I'll reverse the question and ask what post-Keynesians have had to say about behavioural economics, old and new. And I'll conclude by suggesting 4 areas of research where behavioural economics might indeed provide resources for post-Keynesian ideas. First then, was Keynes the first behavioural economist? There seem to be 3 distinct problems here. First, what did Keynes know about psychology? Second, what use did he make of the terms psychology and psychological in the general theory and in his other writings? And thirdly, did his use of psychological terms and ideas contribute significantly to the development of his economics? Now, we know that Keynes was acquainted to some degree with the work of Sigmund Freud. This was noted 30-odd years ago by Ted Winslow in a set of papers, and more recently by the late Gilles Dostaler. But I think there's room for doubt about precisely how deep Keynes's knowledge of Freud really was. There are just a handful of references to Freudian psychology in the 30 volumes of Keynes's collected writings, none of them in the general theory. And I conclude that there are quite strong grounds for being sceptical about Freud's influence on Keynes's own economic thinking. From Fred Glahe's invaluable concordance to the general theory, we know that Keynes used the word psychological 45 times there, and the word psychology 16 times. I've done a content analysis of this, the references in the full version of the paper, shows that these terms are employed in a variety of contexts with at least 4 different meanings, conveying subjectivity, stability, individual preferences, and conventionality. My personal conclusion is that Keynes's escape from habitual modes of thought owed little or nothing to psychology, and the word could have been cut out of his writings altogether or replaced by less rhetorically ambitious but more precise terminology without any loss of meaning, and possibly with some improvement in the clarity of his expression. So to answer Paul's question, was Keynes the first behavioural economist? Well, not really, and for good reasons. The Freudian psychology he knew a little about wasn't really much use to him, and his reasons for rejecting the neoclassical view of rational behaviour related much more to the external macroeconomic environment than to the individual human psyche and its frailties. Nonetheless, it's true that Keynes's brief but perceptive remarks on what might constitute reasonable behaviour in a world characterised by fundamental uncertainty, the use of conventions and rules of thumb, are broadly consistent with old behavioural economics, and they're certainly inconsistent with both the mainstream concept of unbounded rationality and the irrationality which is posited by some of its new behavioural critics. And that leads me neatly into the question of behavioural macroeconomics. In the original paper, Theresa and I were highly critical of behavioural macroeconomics, which we argued had made very little progress since it was foreshadowed in George Akerlof's Nobel acceptance speech. His 2009 book, Animal Spirits, co-authored with Robert Shiller, took its title from Keynes, but seriously misrepresented the fundamental principles of the general theory. Now, I stand by our strong complaints about the book Animal Spirits, but the critique that we made of the broader behavioural macroeconomics project does require a little bit of modification in the light of Ian MacDonald's new edited book, which contains 24 articles published between 1990 and 2009, and a very clear, brief introduction by MacDonald himself. 7 of the 10 parts in this book will cause no problems for post-Keynesians and probably won't cause much excitement either. It's good to have the involuntary nature of much unemployment confirmed by the findings of happiness research, and to find the happiness literature cited in criticism of the supposed benefits of unlimited economic growth. MacDonald draws some very interesting implications from loss aversion and considerations of fairness for the shape of the Phillips curve. He gets a horizontal Phillips curve rather than a vertical Phillips curve. And Akerlof's 2007 paper contains a critique of Ricardian equivalence and of the neutrality of money, reaching post-Keynesian conclusions via a novel and rather intriguing route involving the introduction of social norms into the individual utility functions. And MacDonald's own invocation of various biases in human behaviour, emphasised in behavioural economics, in particular present bias, self-serving bias, new era stories, money illusion, loss aversion and herding effects, to help explain the global financial crisis, offers at least part, probably a significant part of that important story. It's interesting though that you can only find one paper on the global financial crisis in a 2012 book on behavioural macroeconomics. Other aspects of his version of behavioural macroeconomics are more worrying. It's not clear to me that the growth of an underclass is either an incontestable truth or a macroeconomic phenomenon, while the application of ideas from behavioural economics to produce a plan to help people save more begs several questions. And I find even more contentious the 5 papers in part 4 of his book, which apply the efficiency wage hypothesis to the explanation of money wage rigidity and unemployment. I've got no problem with efficiency wage theory as a microeconomic proposition. It's been known for several centuries that high wages often induce high productivity and that workers dislike being treated unfairly, so that there are good reasons why employers are generally not tempted to hire unemployed job applicants at wages below those paid to their existing workforce. But whether this is an explanation, still less the explanation of mass unemployment, is much more questionable. Where does it leave the principle of effective demand, which doesn't seem to feature anywhere in MacDonald's introduction? And how do capitalists implement their dislike of full employment as a threat to discipline in the factories, to quote Pilecki's immortal phrase, if not through their political power over government macroeconomic policy? And this raises major questions of political economy, about which MacDonald and his 24 authors have very little to say. So my conclusion is that I'm still inclined to think that behavioural macroeconomics has more to learn from Post Keynesians than they have to teach us. That's a conclusion reinforced by something I came across after I'd finished this paper, the recently published survey of behavioural economics by Agner and Lowenstein, which has just come out in Kelly Mecky's massive handbook of economic philosophy. This is a 50-page survey of behavioural macroeconomics with a couple of lines on behavioural macroeconomics. I think it's the appropriate conclusion here is watch this space. So that's my reconsideration of behavioural macroeconomics. Something that Theresa and I didn't look at in any detail in our original paper was what the old behavioural economists had to say about macroeconomics. And so I went back and looked at some of the writings of Herbert Simon on this question. Now, Simon is generally regarded as a microeconomist, and there are good reasons for this. There are in his autobiography a few interesting references to Keynes, which I'll leave you to read up on, and some very interesting references to macroeconomics in a couple of papers that he produced back in the early 1960s, when he was working on the analysis of nearly indecomposable systems. There's an Econometrica article on aggregation of variables in dynamic systems, co-authored with Albert Ando, and a better-known paper on the architecture of complexity, which was later used by Peter Earle, one of Simon's more interesting disciples, to explore the possibility of a synthesis of post-Keynesian and Straffian theory. And this turned out to have important implications for the problem that has preoccupied me for several years, the mainstream dogma that macroeconomic theory must have rigorous micro-foundations. Simon doesn't quite address this problem back in 1962. He couldn't have done because the dogma hadn't really been fully articulated by then. But he does very clearly anticipate its weaknesses. In complex systems, he argues, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Not in an ultimate metaphysical sense, but in the very important pragmatic sense that, given the properties of the parts and the laws of their interaction, it is not a trivial matter to infer the properties of the whole. In the face of complexity, Simon concludes, an in-principle reductionist may be at the same time a pragmatic holist. I'd go a bit further than that, but I'd be very happy with that conclusion. When he came to give the Mattioli lectures in 1993, Simon was again primarily concerned with microeconomics, but there are some significant comments on macroeconomics too. He devotes several pages to a discussion of the general theory and ends up by claiming Keynes as the true originator of the economics of bounded rationality, so sort of anticipating Davidson to a certain extent. His third lecture, which has the rather unpromising title, Seeking Empirical Data Outside the Business Firm, has a section in which Simon expresses scepticism about the value of econometric estimation techniques and questions the possibility of providing precise measures of macroeconomic variables. So I'll quote one small piece from this. The quantity of money is not something tangible, measurable against the standard kilogram in Paris, but a state of mind. The quantity of money is a state of mind. More accurately, a composite state of innumerable minds of people who are forming expectations about the future and borrowing or lending, repaying debts or requesting their debtors to repay on the basis of these expectations. It seems a shame that Simon seems to have had very little, if any, contact with post-Keynesians and vice versa. There were a couple of post-Keynesians in the audience in the Mattioli lectures. Robin Maris took issue with the usefulness of bounded rationality in macroeconomics, and Richard Goodwin apparently made some critical comments which weren't included in the published version. Interesting to know if any Italian colleagues here have any information about Goodwin's papers and whether we might be able to find out how he reacted to Simon's Mattioli lectures from that. in the full version of the paper, I'm going to have to skip through this for lack of time, to talk about the work of Peter Earle, another fellow Australian migrant, who in the 1980s made several attempts individually and in joint work with Sheila Dow to incorporate old behavioural ideas into post-Keynesian monetary theory. And I mention in particular an important but neglected paper on George Shackle by Peter Earle and Neil Kay back in 1985, which emphasises the importance of surprises in Shackle's thinking and the important macroeconomics implications of this. So the workings of a multiplier process, Earle and Kay suggest, falsify expectations, and these surprises may then spark off euphoric or depressing super-multiplier effects. And there's more in this vein, and some very interesting comments which I don't think post-Keynesians have taken up on the application of old behavioural ideas to modern financial systems and the basis for financial crises. Peter Earle sort of drifted away from post-Keynesian economics after he left Sterling and moved to the deep south to Tasmania, and has subsequently found the Journal of Economic Psychology a more welcoming outlet for his work than the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, and I think has had some rather rough treatment at the hands of Paul Davidson. I just want to mention a couple of other old behavioural economists working in the tradition of Herbert Simon, who has some really interesting things to say. Back in 1976, the British economist Paul Mosley attempted to apply the principles of satisficing and bounded rationality to the explanation of macroeconomic policy. Seems to have come to nothing, but I think would bear rereading and possibly re-exploration. And in the United States, another of Simon's disciples, John Sterman, took the project in a slightly different direction, combining bounded rationality with the systems dynamics approach of Jay Forrester and Dana Meadows and Dennis Meadows. And in 2000 produced a massive management textbook on applications of systems dynamics, which he wrote as intended as a text in courses on systems thinking, simulation modelling, complexity, strategic thinking, operations and industrial engineering, among others. No mention of economics. But there's considerable economic content. There's a section on investment that stresses ordering and delivery lags and seems to me to be entirely consistent with Koletsky's work in this area, but it comes in a chapter entitled Delays in part 4 of his book, Tools for Modelling Dynamic Systems. He's got a multiplier accelerator model of the business cycle derived from Paul Samuelson's classic 1939 article, but that comes in a chapter on the management supply chain. And he poses the question, is the business cycle dead? Answers it in the negative, which in 2000 was quite a brave thing to do. And that comes in a chapter on the labour supply chain, focusing on a dynamic stock flow model of managers' labour hiring and utilisation decisions. So it's clear that Sterman's intended readership doesn't really include economists, post-Keynesian or otherwise, and he makes very few references to the economic literature and none at all to post-Keynesian authors. And as far as I'm aware, the neglect has been mutual. I can't remember having seen any post-Keynesian author refer to John Sterman's work. And it seems a shame because there are clear affinities with some of the problems that have occupied post-Keynesians over the last 20 or 30 years. So what have post-Keynesians had to say on behavioural economics, old and new? I suspect this is a topic for a PhD thesis rather than 3 minutes in a conference presentation. And I can't claim to offer anything more than some rather selective and impressionistic evidence. I took down a number of books off my own bookshelves by post-Keynesian authors and looked for references to Herbert Simon and bounded rationality and didn't find very many. Therese helped me mount some JSTOR searches in the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, first 29 volumes of which are now available through JSTOR. We found a dozen hits for behavioural economics, and I use both the UK and the US spelling just to be on the safe side. That's in 29 volumes, 116 issues, maybe 1,000 articles. We found 37 references to Herbert Simon, most of them in the 1980s, and 32 references to bounded rationality, even broadening the search to terms like consumer sentiment or investor sentiment, or consumer confidence, or business confidence. Really doesn't alter the conclusion. Most post-Keynesians have made little or no reference to or made any use of behavioural economics. How far this is due to lack of submissions, reflecting a lack of interest in or awareness of behavioural economics by post-Keynesians, and how far it's due to actual or perceived editorial policy, which has led to rejection or failure to submit, I don't know. Now, I've got to confess mea culpa in this regard. I ignored behavioural economics altogether in my history of post-Keynesian economics that came out 10 years ago. And the first edition of the Earle Companion to Post-Keynesian Economics, which appeared in 2003, has no entry on behavioural economics, no index reference to the term. I had to accept the blame for this omission, but in mitigation, I should say that none of the colleagues I consulted on the companion found it necessary to comment on it at the time, and none of the contributors made any reference to bounded rationality or cited the work of Herbert Simon. The second edition, which came out earlier this year, is an improvement on this issue at least. So, to conclude, in one sense, these are cheering results because they suggest that there are substantial unexploited opportunities in the largely unexplored border terrain between behavioural economics and post-Keynesian macroeconomics, possibly implicating also institutional economists who have something in common with behaviourists as well. There are, of course, some dangers. I think it would be unfortunate if the unremitting and relentless individualism of new behavioural economics were to rub off on post-Keynesians, distracting their attention from the social context in which people make their important economic decisions. And I think it would be a tragedy if post-Keynesians were to interpret behavioural economics as providing micro-foundations for their macroeconomics. They don't need micro-foundations. But I suppose I should end on a positive note and stress the opportunities rather than the threats. One priority, I think, might be a behavioural approach to monetary theory, with extensions to financial innovation and to Hyman Minsky's analysis of financial instability, and perhaps also to the theory of monetary policy. Another area where behavioural economics might well have interesting macroeconomic implications is in the modelling of aggregate consumption behaviour. And I think a post-Keynesian assessment of George Katona's contributions in this area is long overdue. A third possibility is the incorporation of material from behavioural economics into the theory of business investment. The old behaviouralists did at least aspire to the construction of a theory of the firm, and I think Keynes can legitimately be criticised for neglecting the organisational psychology and the sociology of the investment decision. And fourthly, a case can be made for revisiting Paul Mosley's application of the core behavioural concepts of satisficing and bounded rationality to the formation of government policy. In particular, government policy in the global financial crisis, which I suspect might provide a really fascinating and very important case study. On one final point, I'm conscious of merely scraping the top of a very large subject. A great deal more research is needed on the relationship between post-Keynesian and behavioural economics since the 1970s. I think there are a large number of potential PhD topics here for younger colleagues who are looking forward. Thank you.